Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Valley Strength. And today we're going to be talking about why you probably should, if you want to increase your 1 rep max, be practicing singles on the competition lifts for powerlifting. Everything that I say here will probably apply to squat, bench, and deadlift, and pretty much any other exercise that you really want to see your 1 rep max improved. So again, this is a powerlifting channel. If you're here, if you're not a powerlifter, we are talking about the best way to improve your performance and represent your strength to the best of your abilities on squat, bench, and deadlift. Pretty much everything that I say here, I think will cross over between those three and any other lift that you want to do. There may be some unique things from lift to lift. I think mostly surrounding arousal. I don't think that the differences in fatigue are really all that high. Fatigue is going to be a big part of this video. I have a different video planned all about fatigue and kind of progressions within a block and our perception of recovery and all of that. That's a complicated video. It's coming. It's going to take me a bit of time to kind of get organized with that one. So I will talk about fatigue in here, but I'm not going to take too much of a deep dive, but just wanted to outline some of the concepts. So to start off with, I would say the first and biggest thing that singles allow us to accomplish is just increased specificity. So specificity is just practicing and applying the demands that a 1 rep max actually has with our lift. Squatting, if we're going into that lift, there's going to be some anxiety as we're putting that bar on our back and approaching the bottom and just actually getting good with hitting depth and controlling that weight through that entire range of motion. I've taken on a lot of pretty good lifters actually relatively recently, particularly some of these like collegiate lifters that are coming from other team programming and have literally never done a single in their training ever in their life. It's kind of an interesting thing because when they start doing singles, they improve at the top end dramatically. But I think a big part of that is that they already did get strong from a lot of the other things that they were doing, but just weren't all that skilled at the 1 rep max. So a lot of times us just including singles in their program does get them better. It makes them a better power lifter, gives them that opportunity to practice what we need in the sport. But I think it is important to say that we are getting stronger by doing a lot of other things. But I do think sometimes people underestimate the value of the single itself. It's not just practice. Doing low reps, high intensity sets, even just a 1 rep at an RPE 8, we'll talk about that later, but a single at 8 does give us a stimulus to get stronger. And I think that's really important, that by practicing some of those higher intensity, lower rep sets, it's not just something that we're using to stoke our ego or to have the practice or just to get ourselves excited. Practicing that skill is something that neurologically, physically does improve our performance there. And that can go a really, really long way. As powerlifters, that's the whole game. That's really what we want to look at. But I think the downside for most people, at least in their minds, is the fatigue associated with the intensity of that one set. So I think that's the place to start here. So as far as the research goes here, and by the way, I'm going to be using a lot of information from Chris Beardsley. He has a great Instagram. He's a strength and conditioning researcher. I'm going to include a link to his frequently asked questions. It's a lot of infographics and things like that. That'll be in the description of this video. Please look at that stuff. Please check it out. If you have questions, so much of my fatigue video will just be based on kind of his information. A lot of the stuff here, I think, is really going to be just referencing his stuff. But anyway, that's me citing my sources, I guess, is his sources or my sources. So anyway, as far as the research is concerned, intensity on its own is much, much less of a contributor to our fatigue than duration, and particularly long durations, high rep sets, even low loading for high rep sets, especially closer to failure. Those things have a much higher contribution to our fatigue than anything else. So basically on a broad spectrum here, doing a 1 rep max single at a 10 RPE is obviously going to be significantly less fatiguing than running a marathon, right? Now there's a spectrum within that, but maybe we could say doing something like a single at a 10 RPE, working up to a max effort single, and then you follow it by 3 sets of 5 that are pretty easy, 75% or so. That's your whole session. There's a very, very hard single in there, something you could not have done anything else, and then a few sets afterwards. That session versus like, let's say a bodybuilding session to where you're gonna do multiple sets of 10, 12 reps, pretty close to failure. You may be doing 3 different exercises for a body part, 3 sets, mostly all taken to failure. According to the research, that is going to have a lot more actual fatigue associated with it than our very, very hard rep. So much of this stuff is perception. And even the research on fatigue really acknowledges that even our perception of effort in the moment influences our fatigue, that our actual central nervous system fatigue is going to be influenced by our perception of effort. Now, a single at 10 feels very, very hard, but I think for anybody that has actually done a bodybuilding set, if you're doing like a hack squat or something like that, and you do a set of 10 at a legitimately 10 RPE, and if you try to do multiple of those sets, that is so much harder. So if we just say perception of effort, it was the hardest rep that you could have done, but is it the hardest total set that you could have done? Probably not. So the fatigue associated with just a single is not as high as people think it is. But I think where the major impact comes in is actually the emotional fatigue after that one set. And that's gonna be a really important thing. And I think a lot of times that's how we want to frame our programming and essentially the whole conversation around singles, because singles are very, very valuable. That including that practice in our programming, especially if we're gonna say that the fatigue associated with that one rep is really not all that high, has a ton of return for us, but at the cost of potentially lowered quality through the rest of our session. And then again, fatigue does kind of come back here because fatigue is also associated with exercise duration. So if I go in and I exercise duration and perception of effort, remember? So if I do a single and I'm like super hyped, I'm getting worked up, I'm all excited, I go in and I'm not having that good of a day, right? And my single ends up being harder than I really wanted it to be. I didn't hit the weight that I wanted. And now after that session, I'm kind of moping around and I'm just not all that into the session anymore. So now my perception of effort and kind of my motivation within the rest of that session has gone down. Probably the quality of my sets has gone down as well, which again, according to the research, one of the biggest things that will influence your ability to get stronger and get stronger as quick as you can is your effort within the sets, meaning that you moving the bar with full intent, full velocity every single rep is going to make you significantly stronger at a much faster rate than coasting a little bit. So if you're not able to stay motivated to be able to continue to try very, very hard, it will influence your strength gains, along with increasing your perception of fatigue from that session and actually increasing your actual fatigue from the session itself. Because now the motivation has gone down, perception of effort has gone up a lot, and there may be some real fatigue associated with the total session, but not necessarily that one single rep that you did. And I think that is a very, very important thing to look at. And we absolutely have to balance it because for sure that rep has a lot of value. But if it takes away the quality from the rest of our session, and as we know, many people, they may have that one bad rep, it turns into a not so great session, which kind of gets them down in the dumps. Then the rest of their training kind of for the rest of the week can be influenced by that, not only from the fatigue from the session, but just our overall kind of emotional investment and quality within our sessions. And those things can kill us, that it makes a really, really big difference in the way that we can continue to train. So I think if we're going to include singles for people, we have to go in with the understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with it. That it is important for us to be able to practice the specific skill that we're trying to accomplish, right? Moving the way that we want with heavy weight. But if it makes the rest of our session worse, then maybe we need to look at how intense that top single is and how much we're weighting it in our own head. So on the subject of improving our skill in our singles with being able to increase our 1 rep max on our competition lifts, some of the good questions that I got when I asked for questions on Instagram or around variations within the competition lifts. And if doing self-limiting variations is a good tool for increasing our 1 rep max specifically, and for sure the answer is yes, but I don't know that I, in this case, would use the word self-limiting as my main way that I would frame this. So we can use, let's say, a paused deadlift or a paused squat. I guess I'll focus on paused squats. That may be one that is a little bit different for most people. So a paused squat, let's say we took that for a single at an 8 RPE. That's our top set for the day instead of doing a competition single. So a single with no pause. That absolutely can help somebody's 1 rep max go up if the qualities that we want from that variation improve things that we want to see on their competition single. So if somebody is maybe lacking a little bit of control and they're hitting the hole too hard and kind of losing their balance, and we think the closer that you get to doing a paused squat with your competition squat, we think that those qualities, a little bit more control and improvement in balance and maybe just kind of awareness around the bottom, improved effort, those kind of things absolutely can help the 1 rep max go up. And that's like one of my favorite things to program, because most people don't do heavy paused squats, or at least like for singles. Oftentimes, that's one of my main go-tos and seems to pretty reliably increase people's 1 rep max strength. Paused deadlifts are a very common one, especially for sumo deadlifters. I think most people find those to be pretty close to similar, as far as what their 1 rep max is. And I don't think it's a self-limiting variation. I think it's a variation that brings out the best rep that people can do. They learn to fight a little bit harder off the floor. They fight for the position. They fight to, improve extension in their upper back. And it makes their 1 rep max go up because they get better at working in those positions, because the rep was hard enough to really make them try. And so that's a really important thing. So if we're going to use variations, they need to be specific to the qualities that we want to see improved with our competition lifts. So like for me, I sink on the bench press, I'm a little bit more explosive, all that. Me doing something like a spoto press or potentially like a tempo bench press or something like that may make me like stronger, but it's probably gonna make me stronger within the qualities that are being demanded within that variation. So me doing a spoto bench press may not increase my 1 rep max on my competition bench press, because even though it's self-limiting, it's different enough from the skills, the feeling that I need to have with my competition lift, and it may work in the wrong direction. So when we're including singles, sure, use a variation, but use a variation that improves what you really want to see. So on that note, buy one at 8, right? A single at an RP 8 is probably the most common exercise prescription. I guess thanks Mike Tashir for that one. But it's as common and prolific as it is for a pretty good reason. So I wanted to take a second to look at why buy one at 8 is so common. So obviously all the stuff I said about doing a single rep is still here. But why does an 8 RPE tend to be the dominant number that people are going to? So if I'm saying an 8 RPE, we're saying that we have 2 reps left in the tank. So whether a paused squat at an 8 RPE, I could have done 2 more reps with the single that I did, with the load that I did. So most of the time, if we're doing a single at 8, it's going to be a load that's pretty hard, right? Upwards of 90% or so as far as our 1 rep max on that variation or competition lift, whatever. But it's probably easy enough that I still have some ability to control how I move, get feedback from the movement itself, and probably improve the qualities of my lifting in the moment and week to week. So if we're going harder than that, I really don't think that there's much of a drawback, right? So if you overshoot, or let's say you're programming a single at 9, a single at 10, I think that could be productive. Those things are probably pretty valuable, but the closer that we get to failure, riding a single at 9, our margin of error closes significantly, right? It's very easy for somebody to misgroove a rep, right? Kind of get out of position just a little bit, not execute it quite as well as they could have, end up failing because of that. Obviously a single at 10, has the highest risk, that we'll ever have there as far as movement quality. But we start to potentially lose some of that ability to manipulate the way that we're moving and improve from session to session, week to week, whatever. We're losing some of that ability to be able to actually improve our lifting with the heaviest of weights. So going back to the fatigue thing, I don't think that overshooting is that horrible of a thing on its own. The fatigue associated with one hard rep, a single at 10, is not that bad. But it's everything that goes after it that is potentially pretty problematic, that people overshoot, they have that very hard rep, and then now they're moping around and they feel like they wasted the session and I'm not lifting well. And then things really go poorly from there. But as far as specificity goes, a single at 10 is a pretty good thing that we could do for actually increasing strength. But it just comes with a lot of other kind of like human costs that are associated with it. And that's, I think, where the big problem is. So absolutely, I do program singles at 8 often. A large portion of my program is a single at 8 for all of those reasons. But kind of depending on the lifter, we may shift it down a little bit. RP 6, RP 7 may stick around a little bit longer. Sometimes it's higher, especially like short range of motion bench pressers, very wide grip, kind of short range of motion. Those people tend to get a lot more 8.5, kind of 9 RPEs from me, because sometimes the unique demands of this skill with that bench press, they just can't really feel it until it gets all the way that hard. That a single at 8 may just feel like pretty effortless, right? That if they only could have done 2 more, it was very, very easy. But it wasn't unique enough to the demands of how hard their bench can feel around their chest. So very high RPE training at that point can be pretty productive. But if you're going further than that, I do think that high RPE training can be really valuable. But again, remember, talking about fatigue, if we're doing higher rep sets, the closer that we are to failure on those, a set of 10 at an 8, is significantly more fatiguing than a single at an 8 or a single at 9 even. So I would be careful how you're implementing that stuff, but I wouldn't worry too much about the single itself, especially if there isn't a huge emotional component associated with it. So I'll definitely talk about this more when I talk about my fatigue video and kind of progressions within blocks. But I do think that us having an ability to repeat those loads, a single at 8 throughout a block is probably a pretty productive strategy. I think most of the time, blocks, my style, I think a lot of other coaches' styles, start with a lighter prescription, single at 6, working up to an 8, 8.5, 9 RP near the end of blocks. But so much of that, again, goes back to our kind of human reaction within the training. And that having kind of that drive to continue to go into the sessions with motivation and put more weight on the bar and actively kind of have a goal at the end of the blocks, those things make a big difference. And I think it's really just the idea of force production. That even on week 1 of a block, a single at 6, I'm going in thinking, okay, later in the block, I'm gonna be doing this single at 9. I need to move with aggression. I need to move with intent. I need to be prepared to be able to move with as much force as I possibly can. So that matters. Me moving with as much intent as I possibly can makes a very good difference while maintaining control and all of that. So as I'm going throughout the block, I think that having that single in the program for most people really helps people invest. That they go into the session, they have the single, and they're gonna try really, really hard, right? Like the single excites them, it makes them feel like powerlifters. And because of that, the whole session gets a little bit more enthusiasm. I could write the exact same program, take out the single, and I think oftentimes where conceptually it could get somebody close to a strong, I think the single does help, but the investment within the session does change. So top sets, a rep set at the top end instead of a single, again, probably adds a lot of value. But the single, I think, just uniquely makes people feel like powerlifters and brings a lot out. And I do think that that kind of motivation, that effort makes a humongous difference. And I do think it's worth including physically and psychologically for all those reasons. But the psychological stuff does matter. And I think lots of times the kind of crash and burn feeling that people get throughout a block is a lot less associated with the real fatigue from doing hard stuff, but more so kind of the perception of intensity, perception of duration, effort within the sets or within the session And those things pile up to where people kind of start feeling like I'm not getting any stronger. So making sure that people are educated on what the purpose of a single is will go a really, really long way. So as a final thought here, I did want to talk about hypertrophy blocks and including singles in that. And I guess if we're talking about hypertrophy blocks, we're saying, should you include singles year round? I guess my first thought here is that I don't think that hypertrophy blocks, a block that's designed specifically to put on more muscle, is as valuable as people think. It takes a long, long time to build muscle for everyone. I mean, even as a new lifter, you're not going to like maximize the hypertrophy in a single, like month or two or 3 months, whatever. And that should kind of be a year-round game, and that goes back to like, how do I write programming? Well, you should probably be doing some accessory work, or certainly you should be doing some accessory work year-round to help maximize your hypertrophy, right? Absolutely, that's gonna be the way to do it. Most likely, for almost everyone, doing the competition lifts, squat, bench, and deadlift, should not be the main way, or even like close to it, that you're really expecting to build your muscle mass. They can help. They're not gonna do nothing, but something like a belt squat or a hack squat or leg press or whatever is going to go much, much further for building your quads, the size, than a squat will. It's just not going to be able to apply enough stimulus to the quads, especially when we're talking about the fatigue and kind of like, the associated perception of effort within that. So when we'll say that we're writing some sort of hypertrophy block. And I guess what my definition of that would mean is that I'm taking a little bit of time to reduce the total magnitude or the total workload of my competition lifts within a session. And I'm adding a little bit more accessories kind of with that space. So let's say bench press, instead of me working up to a single and doing, a couple heavy back downs, and maybe I'm doing 4 or 5 sets total, I'm saying, look, I don't want to invest all that time. I'm going to let my kind of the upper end coast a little bit for now, and I want to do a lot more accessories. Fine. All right. So I'm going to do a top single and then maybe 2 back downs or something like that, and then more accessories after it. In this case, I think that you including the single probably has significant value. Maybe even more so than when you're doing heavy training consistently, because that skill does take time to acquire. That if you're not exposing yourself to some of those heavier weights relatively often, that it is going to take you a little bit of time to get reacclimated to how that weight feels on your back, how it feels in your hands, the way that you have to move, the way that you have to approach it. And sometimes it can take multiple months to get that skill back all the way. So even if you are doing a more hypertrophy style block, working up to a single at a 7 or a single at an 8 probably still has a ton of value, but I think this is where the emotional stuff matters a ton. The single will not fatigue you enough to really take away from your hypertrophy training unless you let it. Unless in those moments, and this is I think the main problem, that people work up to that single and they're thinking, I'm in this hypertrophy block, but I still really, really care about my single. And then it doesn't go quite as well as it was during their real strength block. And so now it's 10 kilos, 15 kilos lighter, and now they're doing the same thing, like, well, I'm just getting weaker, this hypertrophy block isn't working. You gotta keep the goal. But it can absolutely increase your ability to get back into shape for powerlifting when you move back into it. But I just don't think that writing hypertrophy blocks is really the best way to do it, and you should probably be doing that stuff kind of year round anyway. So I think that's all I have to say on singles. If you do have any questions, leave me a comment. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.